Now look, I want you to sit with me for a minute on this one, because this is one of those nights where the surface story and the real story are two very different things. It's late in the day, the kind of hour when press rooms usually go quiet, and instead the lights come back on. An emergency press conference gets called with almost no notice. Cameras scramble into position, and every reporter in that room already knows this isn't routine. On the surface, this looks like just another hastily arranged briefing, one more item in an endless scroll of political news. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, it tells you something about where this race and where this country actually stands right now. And most people watching the clips tonight didn't realize what actually shifted in that room. This touches your ballot, your representation, and the direction the next few years take for your family. And here's what I want you to hold on to before we go further. There's a decision being made behind closed doors right now that we're going to come back to, because that's the part that changes everything about how this election settles out. And there's a date coming up on the calendar that may matter more than anything said at that podium tonight. Hold on to that. We'll get there. I've covered enough of these emergency briefings over the years to know the pattern by heart. And I want to walk you through it slowly tonight, not because it's complicated in the way people assume, but because the pieces matter, and rushing past them is exactly how so many viewers end up misunderstanding what actually happened here. So stay with me. We're going to take this piece by piece, the way it deserves. Now, to understand tonight, you got to understand how we got here, because the chain of events matters more than the headline. Elections in this country rarely turn on a single moment. They turn on a slow accumulation of small moments, each one nudging public opinion a degree or two, until one night the accumulated pressure finally breaks the surface. That's what an emergency press conference usually signals. Not a new problem, but an old pressure finally forcing its way into the open. Think about how campaigns actually build over months. There's the announcement phase, when a candidate or a party rolls out its message and everybody's optimistic. Then there's the grind, the debates, the ad wars, the town halls that blur into each other. Through all of that, campaigns are managing dozens of small fires, a staffing dispute here, a policy reversal there, a poll number that dips for a week and recovers. Most of the public never sees these fires because campaigns are built in part to contain them. An emergency press conference means containment failed. Something got big enough, fast enough, that the normal channels, a quiet statement, a background briefing, a surrogate on a Sunday show, weren't enough anymore. Every decision echoes for years. What we're watching tonight is the echo of choices made months, sometimes years earlier. Decisions about who to trust with sensitive information. Decisions about which coalition partners to fold into a campaign apparatus. Decisions about how much daylight to allow between a candidate's public statements and the actual state of affairs inside the campaign. Tonight's press conference is downstream of all of that. It's the visible tip of an iceberg that's been forming quietly for a long time. Think back to how these cycles usually start. Somewhere early on, A strategic bet gets made. A bet about which voters to chase, which issues to lean into, which uncomfortable questions to simply not answer and hope nobody presses. For a while, that bet looks smart. Fundraising numbers come in strong. Rallies draw crowds. The bet gets validated in the short term, which is exactly what makes it dangerous, because early validation convinces a campaign that the bet was correct rather than merely early. It's only months later, when circumstances change, when a piece of information surfaces that nobody anticipated, when an ally becomes a liability, that the original bet gets tested. And that test, more often than not, looks exactly like tonight. A hastily called room full of cameras, a candidate or spokesperson standing where they never expected to stand, explaining something they never expected to have to explain. I've watched this pattern across administrations and across parties, and it holds with remarkable consistency. The emergency press conference is rarely the disease. It's the fever, the visible symptom of something that's been building under the surface for a long time. Whether that's an internal power struggle, a donor relationship gone sideways, or a piece of due diligence that got skipped in the rush to get a campaign off the ground. Understanding that distinction matters because it changes how you should read everything that follows tonight. This isn't a standalone event. It's a data point in a much longer story, and tonight is just the moment that story became visible to all of us at once. Let me be precise here because the details matter more than anybody's spin. When a campaign or an administration calls an emergency briefing outside the normal news cycle, there are really only a handful of categories that explain it. A legal development that can't be contained by leak management, an internal defection or resignation that's about to become public through other channels, a data point, usually polling or fundraising, so severe that getting ahead of the story is less damaging than letting it break on someone else's terms, or an external event, sometimes geopolitical, sometimes domestic, that reshapes the strategic picture overnight. Reporters covering these moments will tell you the tell is in the timing. A press conference called at 4 p.m. on a Friday is designed to bury a story over the weekend news cycle. One called mid-morning on a Tuesday, cameras rolling live, means the campaign wants control of the narrative because they believe the story is coming out one way or another, and they'd rather shape it than react to it. Watch the body language of the staff standing along the wall, not just the person at the microphone. Campaign veterans will tell you that's often where the real information is, in who looks surprised and who looks like they've known for days. Watch, too, for the specific word choices in the prepared statement versus the answers given under questioning. A prepared statement is lawyered and message tested. The Q&A is where the truth leaks out around the edges because reporters press on specifics that no script anticipated. Let me be even more precise about how to read the room itself, because the details here matter more than most viewers realize. Notice who gets called on first. Press secretaries and communications directors often work out in advance an order of questioners designed to front-load friendlier outlets and push the hardest questions later. When the cameras have thinned and fewer viewers are still watching live. If you see a campaign opening with a wire service reporter known for straightforward, non-adversarial questions, that's a deliberate choice to set a calm tone before anything sharper gets asked. Notice, too, the length of the answers. Short, clipped responses to hard questions are a sign of legal caution. Someone in that room has been told explicitly not to elaborate. Long, meandering answers are often the opposite, an attempt to bury a difficult admission inside enough words that it doesn't register as the headline. Notice the specific language used to describe the underlying issue. Mischaracterization is a soft word chosen to suggest confusion rather than deception. Ongoing review is a phrase designed to close the door on further questions without technically declining to answer. No further comment at this time is often the most honest sentence in the entire briefing, because it tells you indirectly that there is more to this story than anyone in that room is currently willing to say. These aren't accidents of language. Communications professionals choose these words with real precision, because in politics, the exact phrase used today becomes the sentence quoted in every follow-up story tomorrow. Now, let me put my analyst hat on for a minute, because the strategy here is worth examining honestly. There are really three effects an emergency press conference can have on a race. And this is where it gets complicated, because they don't always point the same direction. First, it can consolidate a base. Nothing rallies committed supporters like the perception of an unfair attack or an unjust pile-on. If the framing of the press conference casts the candidate as under siege, you'll often see a short-term bump in small-dollar donations and volunteer sign-ups in the 48 to 72 hours after. That's a real, measurable effect. And campaigns know it, which is one reason some emergency briefings are handled with more defiance and contrition. Second, it can bleed the undecided middle. The voters who ultimately decide close elections are rarely the most engaged partisans. They're the exhausted, skeptical, late deciding voters who are watching for any signal that a candidate can't handle pressure or isn't being straight with them. An emergency press conference handled poorly is exactly the kind of moment that confirms their worst suspicions. You don't lose the base in these moments. You lose the middle. And third, and this is the one campaign strategists worry about most, it can shift the entire frame of the race. Elections are, at bottom, contests over what story voters believe they're voting in. A press conference forced by outside events can hijack that frame entirely, turning a race that was about the economy, say, into a race about trust or competence or scandal. Once the frame shifts, it rarely shifts back before Election Day. So ask yourself the honest question: who benefits from the subject of this election changing? Because somebody usually does, and it isn't always the person standing at the podium. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Opposing campaigns rarely need to manufacture these moments themselves anymore. They simply need to be ready to amplify them the instant they occur, and to have the paid media and surrogate network prepared to keep the story alive past its natural lifespan. That's the quiet, less discussed part of modern campaign strategy. Not creating the crisis, but stockpiling the resources to extend its shelf life.